17-year-old Zara Thompson sat motionless in her seat, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk as the world around her faded into a thick, unnatural silence. The classroom, usually buzzing with the low hum of restless teenagers, felt suddenly still, paralyzed by disbelief or something heavier. In her hands, she held the source of that silence, a mathematics test paper marked with a perfect red 100% at the top. It should have felt like a victory. It should have tasted like relief. But instead, it was bitter, like the calm before a storm she had long sensed coming. The weight of 100 eyes pressed against her skin, but one gaze cut deeper than the rest: Mr. Leonard Grayson, her advanced math teacher. His face contorted as if the sight of her score was physically painful, as if the ink on her paper spelled betrayal. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't smile or nod or offer the typical dull, "well done," he handed out to the Logan Barretts and Macy Whitfields of the world. Instead, he stared at her as though she were a glitch in his system, a broken logic in a world he believed was perfectly ordered. And in that system, girls like Zara didn't belong at the top. She felt her pulse ticking in her ears as Grayson stepped forward, test paper in hand, the way a detective might hold evidence that confirmed his darkest suspicion. "This," he said, voice taut and sharp, "is impossible." A few scattered chuckles broke out across the room. Low, smug, the kind of laughter that didn't require words to wound. Zara straightened her spine. Her instincts told her what was coming, but still, she held out hope that she was wrong. Maybe it was just disbelief. Maybe it was surprise. But then came the next blow, a subtle pause, a look cast down at her skin, and a question veiled as accusation. How had she done it? How could she, of all people, have scored higher than every other student in his class? It wasn't a genuine question. It was an indictment wrapped in faux curiosity. Grayson didn't ask because he wanted to understand. He asked because he refused to believe. And Zara understood, with sickening clarity, that this had never been about the test. It had always been about her. This wasn't the first time he had looked through her instead of at her. For months, she had sat in his class, her hand raised, her mind sharp, her answers correct, and yet he barely acknowledged her. Meanwhile, Logan and Macy, both white, both comfortably privileged, basked in his praise for doing the bare minimum. Every compliment he withheld from her had built up, brick by invisible brick, into a wall she was now being asked to climb, only to be told the wall shouldn't even be there. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but her voice caught on the realization that this moment had been waiting to happen. No matter how many equations she solved, no matter how many nights she spent studying when the world slept, someone like Mr. Grayson would always be waiting at the finish line, not to congratulate her, but to move the goalpost. The perfect score in her hands no longer felt like a triumph. It felt like a trigger, one that exposed not her capabilities, but the fragile prejudice hidden behind a teacher's smile. The truth wasn't just that Zara was smart. The truth, the one too shocking for Grayson to process, was that she was exceptional. And for him, that reality was unacceptable. As the air grew heavier and the classroom colder, Zara realized this wasn't just her test. It was a test of something much bigger. Not math, not logic, but truth. And this time, the one being graded wasn't her. It was him. Zara's knuckles whitened as Mr. Grayson's words struck the air like a gavel. "There's no way you got this score fairly." The sentence, flat and final, sent a ripple through the room, a collective gasp followed by a charged silence. Time slowed. Somewhere behind her, a chair creaked, a pen dropped. But Zara's focus tunneled inward, zeroing in on the man at the front of the room who had just accused her, publicly, deliberately, of being a fraud. Her voice, when it emerged, was tight with disbelief. "Are you accusing me of cheating?" It was more than a question. It was a challenge, a plea for dignity. But Grayson didn't flinch. "I am." The words landed like a slap. Around the classroom, students shifted in their seats, some unsure, some entertained. Logan Barrett laughed, not loudly but enough. Macy covered her mouth in mock surprise, though the upward twitch of her lips betrayed her pleasure. The message was clear. Zara didn't belong in this spotlight. Not in this victory. Zara's breath came faster now, shallow and unsteady. Her heart pounded with a strange cocktail of anger and shame, emotions that didn't quite fit together until now. She had done everything right. Studied late. Solved problem after problem until the numbers blurred into sleeplessness. She had earned that score. But to Grayson, that achievement wasn't a sign of brilliance. It was a threat. "You don't believe me," she said quietly, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a rising, controlled fury. "Because I didn't write my steps down? Because I did the work in my head?" Grayson sneered, as if the idea itself was laughable. "So, you magically solved college-level calculus in your head?" He turned to the class with exaggerated incredulity. If she really understood this test, she should be able to rework the problems right now. He slammed a blank sheet of paper on her desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Zara stared at it, her breath catching. Not because she couldn't do it again, she could. But because this wasn't about proving knowledge. It was about power. He wasn't asking her to show her work. He was demanding she prove her worth. She looked up at him, her jaw tight. "Why don't you ask Logan or Macy to redo their answers?" Grayson's expression darkened. "They didn't score a perfect 100. You did." Zara's voice dropped, but her words cut sharper for it. "Maybe you just don't believe a black girl can be smarter than your favorite students." The room froze. There it was, spoken aloud. The truth that had always lingered unspoken between them, now out in the open, undeniable. Grayson's face flushed deep red, his mouth tightening into a bitter line. He looked like a man cornered, exposed, furious not at the accusation, but at its accuracy. He took a step forward, his voice rising, desperate to reclaim control. "I don't care what nonsense you're spewing. I'm reporting this to the principal." He snatched her test paper off the desk and crushed it in his fist, the sound of crumpling paper more violent than it should have been. "Your grade is invalid." Zara's stomach turned. Her mouth opened slightly in disbelief. "This isn't fair," she whispered. Grayson leaned in, his tone cold and final. "Life isn't fair." Then came the sound of salvation. The classroom door opened with a deliberate swing, and the tall figure of Principal Marcus Dean filled the threshold. His presence was immediate, grounding. His eyes scanned the room like a judge entering a courtroom, stopping only when they reached Grayson. "Mr. Grayson," he said, his tone calm but heavy with authority. "Can I have a word?" For the first time that morning, Grayson hesitated. He glanced at Zara, at the crumpled paper in his hand, then back at the principal. There was no choice. He followed Dean out of the classroom, the door shutting behind them with a final thud. The moment he left, the air seemed to shift. Whispers bloomed in every corner, hushed and electrified. Logan leaned toward Macy, muttering something cruel Zara didn't need to hear to understand. But she didn't respond. She couldn't. Her ears were still ringing, her fingers trembling from the adrenaline crash. Her perfect score had become a public trial. Her intelligence a crime to be defended. She sat there, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the door. Something inside her had cracked open, not broken, but revealed. The truth had stepped into the light. And it wasn't done yet. The hallway was quieter than it should have been. The only sounds were the sharp clicks of Principal Dean's shoes against the linoleum floor and Zara's own heartbeat, thudding in her ears like a warning drum. Her palms were clammy, her breath shallow. This wasn't how the day was supposed to go. She was supposed to feel proud, seen. But instead, she walked beside the principal like a defendant being led to trial. They stopped outside the guidance office. Ms. Perez, the school counselor, stood by a laptop perched on a wheeled cart. Her expression was tight with concern but softened the moment her eyes met Zara's. The girl's shoulders, hunched from humiliation, lifted slightly at the sight of someone who wasn't looking through her, but at her. Principal Dean gestured toward the screen. "Do you know what this is?" Zara nodded. "The classroom security footage," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dean pressed play, without another word. The footage, grainy and tinted with the sterile green of institutional lighting, showed an empty classroom earlier that morning. Grayson appeared on screen alone. He moved toward his desk, a stack of tests in his hand. As he flipped through them, his demeanor shifted. When he reached Zara's test, he paused. Something in his face hardened, jaw locking, brows knitting. He stared at the paper for too long. Then, as if losing control of his own reaction, he slammed it down, muttering to himself. His lips moved fast, but there was no audio. Ms. Perez leaned forward, adjusting the playback speed. "Watch this part." Grayson looked around to ensure no one was nearby. He took out his phone, typed something quickly, then picked up Zara's test again. This time, his expression twisted in disgust. The words were clearer now as he muttered aloud, his mouth forming a sentence like a curse. "There's no way in hell she's that smart." Zara flinched. The sentence echoed louder in her mind than it had on his lips. Not just because of the cruelty, but because of the familiarity. She'd heard versions of it before. In the way teachers skipped over her raised hand. In the way classmates assumed she needed help before she asked for it. In the way her excellence was always met with disbelief, not celebration. Dean stood silent beside her, letting the footage speak for itself. "We've been reviewing more than just today," he said finally, voice low. "This wasn't a one-time lapse. It's a pattern." Zara turned toward him, her brow furrowed. "A pattern?" Ms. Perez nodded gently. "You're not the first student he's treated unfairly. But you may be the first one with clear proof." Something stirred inside her, something deeper than anger, deeper than pain. It was vindication, but tangled with grief. Grayson hadn't just questioned her test score. He had questioned her very capacity to excel. And now, that doubt had been peeled back, revealing a truth no accusation could erase. Then the door burst open. Grayson stormed in, red-faced and trembling with rage. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "That footage doesn't prove anything." Dean didn't flinch. "It proves enough." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "So, you're going to take her word over mine?" Dean stepped forward, his calm turning sharp. "No," he said. "I'm taking the evidence over your prejudice." For a moment, Grayson looked genuinely stunned, like a man who had spent so long swimming in his own certainty that he never thought he'd be pulled under. He opened his mouth to object, but there was nothing left to say. Behind him, 2 security officers appeared silently in the hall. Dean's voice was steady. "Mr. Grayson, you are officially suspended. Effective immediately." Grayson stared, waiting for someone to stop this, to speak up for him. But no one did. Ms. Perez said nothing. Zara said nothing. And the security officers took a step closer. The moment cracked, and Grayson, with a snarl of disbelief, turned and walked away. His footsteps faded down the hall like the last echoes of a collapsed illusion. Zara stood still, numb. Dean turned to her, and for the first time that day, he smiled, not politely, not performatively, but with genuine pride. "You, Miss Thompson," he said, "have just earned yourself a full-ride scholarship." Her breath caught in her throat. "Wait, what?" "We reached out to a few academic organizations. They saw the footage. But more importantly, they saw you. Your resilience. Your brilliance. They were impressed." Zara didn't speak. She couldn't. Words felt too small for the emotions swelling in her chest. For a long time, she'd learned to survive in silence, letting her work speak for her, letting injustice pass unchallenged because challenging it too loudly made you a problem. But today, her voice had been heard. And more than that, believed. She felt the warmth of something she hadn't let herself hope for, not just justice, but recognition. And this time, it couldn't be taken away. The news moved through the school like a quiet storm, at first just a whisper carried from locker to locker, then a roar echoing through the hallways. By the time Zara returned to her seat in third period, it was no secret. Mr. Grayson had been suspended. Some students looked at her with wide-eyed awe, like she'd done something heroic. Others averted their gaze, uncertain where they stood in a world where the authority figure had been exposed as the villain. But Zara sat silently, her hands resting still on her desk, her mind not yet caught up with the reality that her voice had changed something bigger than herself. When the lunch bell rang, the cafeteria buzzed like a hive stirred from sleep. Conversations layered over one another, fragments of disbelief, mockery, support. Zara walked in, tray in hand, her presence triggering a lull in the noise. Eyes followed her. Some smiled. Some didn't. She moved with quiet resolve, settling into a table by the window. She didn't need the attention. She had never wanted it. All she had ever wanted was to be seen fairly, for her mind, not her skin, to define her. Her phone vibrated, pulling her eyes downward. Message after message lit up the screen. "You did it, girl. I'm so proud. Saw what happened. That was messed up. Glad the truth came out. Guess he finally got what was coming." But not every message was kind. A few were anonymous, filled with venom masked as disbelief. "You must have snitched. Can't believe you pulled a race card. You think this makes you better than everyone?" She set her phone face down. Across the room, Logan Barrett sat with his usual clique. His laugh was low, mirthless. Next to him, Macy Whitfield stirred her salad, not touching it, her eyes flitting toward Zara with a mixture of irritation and something close to fear. Logan leaned back in his chair, his voice just loud enough to carry. "Biggest scam of the year," he muttered, shaking his head. Zara pretended not to hear. She had learned that sometimes silence said more than confrontation ever could. But the silence was broken when Logan stood, his tray barely touched, his ego bruised. He walked over, his footsteps casual, calculated. "Yo, Zara," he called, voice laced with mockery. "How does it feel to play the victim and get rewarded for it?" The question hung in the air, slicing through conversations around them. A few students turned to listen. Others held their breath. Zara looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me," she said, voice calm, but the edge beneath it was razor-sharp. Logan crossed his arms. "You cheated. Grayson called you out, and instead of proving you earned it, you ran crying to the principal. Classic." His smirk widened, expecting her to stumble, to snap. But Zara stood, pushing her chair back with a deliberate grace. Her eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't rise. "The only person who got exposed here was Grayson," she said. "And you know what hurts the most for people like you? It's not that I passed. It's that I passed without your permission." A stunned hush fell over the nearby tables. Logan scoffed. "Please. You just got lucky." Zara took a step closer, her voice now low and steady, every word chosen like a scalpel. "Lucky? Was it luck when Grayson ignored me every time I raised my hand? Was it luck when I stayed up studying while you copied off your friend? Or maybe, just maybe, what's really bothering you is that a black girl outsmarted you. And no scholarship, no spotlight, no suspension was needed to prove that I did it on paper. And I did it fairly." Logan's face flushed. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Behind him, Macy stood, tugging his sleeve, urging him to walk away. He muttered something under his breath, something cowardly and forgettable, then turned and stalked off, leaving behind a silence that felt like victory. Some students clapped, quietly, respectfully. Others nodded at Zara as if seeing her for the first time, not as a disruption or a footnote, but as a force. She sat back down, her body finally relaxing into the chair. The whirlwind had passed. Grayson was gone. And for once, it wasn't just about what had been taken away from someone corrupt. It was about what had been given back to someone who had earned it. Her dignity, her place, her right to be brilliant without apology. In the solitude of that moment, with the cafeteria slowly returning to its usual rhythm, Zara realized that justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it looked like silence in the face of chaos. Sometimes, it looked like holding your ground when others expected you to crumble. And sometimes, it looked like sitting alone at a table, with your head held high, knowing that the truth had finally spoken louder than the doubt. The next morning, the air at Lincoln High was different. There was no announcement, no bell that sounded any different than the ones that came before, but something had shifted, an undercurrent in the way students moved through the hallways, in the subtle hush that followed Zara Thompson's footsteps. She wasn't just the girl who had aced a test anymore. She had become a symbol, whether people liked it or not. At 9 a.m., the school held an unscheduled assembly. The auditorium, usually reserved for pep rallies and mundane faculty meetings, was now filled to capacity. Students filtered in slowly at first, then in steady waves, curious, anxious, whispering guesses about what was coming. The teachers sat off to the side, their faces taut, guarded, some supportive, others unreadable. Zara sat near the front, flanked by a few students she barely knew but who had chosen, in this moment, to sit beside her. She felt their silent solidarity, like warmth at her back. But inside, her nerves coiled tightly. She didn't know what was about to happen, only that the eyes of hundreds were already fixed on her, whether they were looking or not. Principal Dean stepped onto the stage. He didn't raise his hands to hush the room. He didn't need to. His presence commanded silence. He wore a navy suit today, darker than his usual choice, his expression unreadable but steady. "Good morning," he began, his voice clear, carrying easily through the auditorium. "I won't take much of your time, but what happened yesterday cannot go unspoken." The room tensed. Every seat seemed to grow still. "As many of you know," Dean continued, "a member of our faculty, Mr. Leonard Grayson, was suspended after security footage confirmed a pattern of bias, discrimination, and inappropriate conduct toward one of our students." Gasps. Mutters. A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd, some of it defensive, some of it relieved. "But this isn't about one man," Dean said, lifting his chin. "This is about the culture we allow to fester in silence. This is about the students who go unseen, unheard, and unrecognized because of something as shallow as their skin, their name, or where they come from. And that stops now." Zara's breath caught. The words landed heavier than she expected. She had braced herself for acknowledgement, maybe even a token gesture of apology. But this was something else. This was reckoning. Dean looked toward her then. His voice softened, but didn't lose its strength. "Zara Thompson," he said, "please stand." Every heartbeat in the room seemed to sync with hers as she slowly rose. Her palms were damp, her legs slightly shaky. She didn't meet every gaze, just his. "You did more than solve equations on a test," Dean said. "You stood your ground when it would have been easier to stay silent. You forced us to confront something ugly, and you did it with grace, intelligence, and courage. That is why I'm proud to announce that you've been awarded a full academic scholarship to any university of your choice." A stunned hush fell across the auditorium, then erupted into applause. It wasn't hesitant or obligatory. It was real. Students stood. Teachers, too. Some clapped with their hands. Others clapped with tears in their eyes. And for a moment, Zara forgot the whispers, the doubts, the laughter that had once mocked her. She remembered only this. She had been right to believe in herself. Dean smiled. "Congratulations, Miss Thompson. You've earned this." As she sat down, the applause still lingering in the air, Zara felt something she hadn't dared hope for, not vindication, but transformation. This moment wasn't just hers. It belonged to every student who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or diminished. And for the first time in Lincoln High's recent memory, the institution itself seemed to shift, to hold a mirror to its own reflection and begin, finally, to change. Later that day, a bulletin was posted in the teacher's lounge. The school board had launched a full investigation into faculty behavior, with a focus on inclusion and equity. Anonymous student testimonies were encouraged. Training programs were already being scheduled. The air had changed. In the days that followed, the tone in the classroom was noticeably different. Some teachers, ones who had always walked a line, now spoke with care they hadn't shown before. Others, like Ms. Jameson from English Lit, approached Zara after class, voice low, face warm. "You showed strength," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." But not everyone transformed. Some students continued to mutter, to roll their eyes. Some held onto their bitterness like a shield, like Logan and Macy, who barely showed up to class now. But they were quieter. Their power had dulled, not because Zara had fought them directly, but because truth had taken away the ground they stood on. Zara didn't walk taller now. She had always walked tall. But now, the world around her had learned to see her height. That made all the difference. Justice, she realized, wasn't a moment. It was a process. A chain reaction. One brave step creating a ripple, then a wave, until the tides began to turn. And at the heart of it all was a girl with a mind like fire and the courage to let it burn through silence. For a few fleeting weeks, it felt like change might settle quietly into the bones of Lincoln High. Like maybe the storm had passed. But history never unwinds itself so easily. Beneath the applause, beneath the public commendations and polished statements, there remained shadows. Small, sharp ones. Whispers returned. Not from the loud ones this time, but from behind closed doors, from subtle glances that weighed heavy without ever saying a word. Some students began framing Zara's stand not as courage, but as disruption. She cost a teacher his job, they said. She made the school look bad. No one dared say it outright in public, but the subtext was everywhere. Her resistance had embarrassed the system. And systems, even when forced to bend, don't forget what made them yield. Zara felt it first when her AP Physics project proposal on advanced AI modeling was rejected without feedback, something unheard of for a student with her record. Then came the delayed responses from her college applications, strange and sudden. Even though she'd been told she was a top contender. One morning, she opened her locker to find her notebooks soaked in ink, pages she had spent weeks annotating for scholarship submissions, now a mess of bleeding blue. No name, no note, just the silence of cowardice. At first, she didn't cry. Not out loud. She felt it all compressing inside her like lead. And then she did something she hadn't done since the incident with Grayson began. She asked herself whether she had made a mistake. Not about the truth. That was never in question. But about the cost. She sat alone in the chemistry lab after school, the winter sun bleeding through the blinds in slow golden strips. Her reflection in the glass was faint, blurred, tired. A question sat quietly in her chest. How much more do I have to give before they see me as human? But that night, something shifted. Her mother found her sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by torn pages and old notes. Zara was cutting and gluing, reshaping them into something new. Collages of equations, poems, photos of Black mathematicians, quotes from her own diary, and screenshots of hate-filled messages she had received. "What are you making?" her mother asked, eyes worried. Zara looked up, and for the first time in days, her eyes burned with clarity. "A wall," she said. "Or maybe a stage." The next day, she requested access to the school's atrium gallery, a glass-walled space usually reserved for senior art exhibits or club promotions. Principal Dean hesitated at first. She noticed it in his eyes, the calculation, the doubt. But then, remembering the public pressure still simmering from the fallout, he agreed. By Friday, Zara had installed her exhibit. She called it proof. It wasn't just a protest, it was a reckoning. Each panel told a story. One wall displayed her perfect test scores alongside the accusations of cheating, with quotes from Grayson etched underneath in bold type. Another displayed student testimonials, anonymous ones, of discrimination they had experienced at Lincoln High, laid over stark black and white portraits. The third wall was a timeline, her journey from silence to voice, from shame to action, culminating in a bold letter addressed to those who refused to see me. It read, "This school tried to teach me to shrink, to swallow brilliance because it shines too bright for comfort. I was told that excellence must look a certain way, sound a certain way, be born into a certain kind of skin. But I learned something else. Brilliance cannot be boxed. Truth cannot be silenced. And I will not apologize for refusing to disappear." Students stood stunned. Some read in silence. Others took photos, whispering to each other with new understanding. Even teachers came, some visibly uncomfortable, others clearly moved. Ms. Jameson wept quietly in the corner. But the moment that marked something irreversible came when Zara stood beneath the center display, surrounded by her creation, and looked Principal Dean in the eye as he approached. "You didn't ask for permission to speak this loudly," he said, his voice not unkind, but cautious. "No," Zara replied. "And I won't apologize for it either." Dean paused, then nodded slowly. "Then I suppose you've changed more than just a school policy." "I wasn't trying to change a policy," she said. "I was trying to survive. This," she gestured around her, "is what survival looks like." That day, the atrium became more than a gallery. It became a forum. Students began adding to the installation, notes, letters, memories. For the first time, it felt like the walls of Lincoln High weren't just holding history. They were exposing it. Zara didn't smile much that week. Not because she wasn't proud, but because pride isn't always loud or bright. Sometimes, it's a quiet refusal to be broken. Sometimes, it's standing still when the wind tries to move you. Sometimes, it's the quiet truth in your chest whispering, "This is who I am. I will not bend for you." And so, resistance became not just a moment in Zara's life, but a permanent part of her being. Not just bold, but deliberate. Not loud, but undeniable. And that was enough. By spring, the atrium had transformed from an art space into something else entirely, an evolving testament to truth. What began as Zara's solitary defiance had become a living installation of resistance, grief, and finally, renewal. Each week, new artifacts were added: photos, folded notes, anonymous letters from students once too afraid to speak, now giving voice to their own quiet revolutions. What once was a wall had turned into a chorus. But institutions change slowly, even when cracks start to show. After Grayson's dismissal and the subsequent investigation, the district board imposed mandatory diversity and ethics training. Faculty meetings turned uncomfortable, then thoughtful. Committees were formed to revise hiring policies, mentorship systems were proposed for students from underrepresented backgrounds, and the school introduced an anonymous reporting system for academic discrimination. The changes weren't perfect. They didn't fix everything. But they were visible, structural, rooted. And they bore Zara's fingerprint. She wasn't looking for gratitude. Not really. But when she received the invitation, hand-delivered, printed on thick ivory cardstock with the school crest at the top, her breath still caught in her throat. "The Board of Education and the Lincoln High Leadership Committee cordially invite you to speak at the 112th Annual Academic Honors Convocation." The keynote speaker. Her. Zara Thompson. The same girl who had been accused of cheating less than a year ago. At first, she considered saying no. She didn't want a spotlight. They'd already watched her too closely for too long. But something inside her shifted. The idea of taking the stage, not to perform but to reclaim it, to turn a space of tradition into one of truth, was too powerful to ignore. The night of the ceremony, she wore a black dress with gold trim, subtle, sharp. Her hair braided back in neat lines that felt regal. When she walked across the polished wooden stage of the school's main hall, the applause was slow to rise, not out of reluctance, but awe. There was something quiet about her presence, something measured. It demanded respect without begging for it. She stood at the podium, her notes folded in her hand, untouched. "I was 12 the first time someone told me I was smart for a black girl," she began, her voice steady, resonant in the vast hall. "They thought it was a compliment. I thought it was a warning." She let the words hang in the silence, heavy but necessary. "I've spent most of my academic life learning to navigate expectation, the ones placed on me and the ones taken from me. I've been doubted, overlooked, congratulated too late, and questioned too soon. But I've also learned something far more powerful than equations or test scores." She paused, met the gaze of the students and faculty alike. "I've learned that truth carries risk, but silence carries a price." A quiet murmur moved through the crowd, agreement, perhaps, or reflection. "I stand here not because I fit into your image of success," she continued, "but because I refuse to let that image define me. And I'm not alone." There are students in this room who carry stories you've never asked to hear, who are brilliant not despite what they've endured, but because of it. She closed her speech without dramatics. No flourish, no forced tears. Just the clear, uncompromising truth of someone who had lived through something and come out sharper. The standing ovation was not polite this time, it was seismic. Principal Dean stood first. Others followed. Even some of her former critics, those who had once doubted her, now applauded not out of obligation but recognition. After the ceremony, students, freshmen, sophomores, seniors, lined up to speak to her. Some just said thank you. Others cried. One girl, barely 15, clutched Zara's hand and whispered, "You made me believe I could be more than what they see." In the weeks that followed, Zara's name became more than a headline. The school named a new scholarship program after her, the Zara Thompson Initiative for Academic Integrity and Equity. It offered mentoring, funding, and academic support to students from marginalized communities, designed to recognize brilliance before it had to fight for acknowledgement. Zara didn't take full credit. She didn't want it. But when she passed through the atrium one final time before graduation, her display still standing, now framed with fresh student editions, she let herself pause. She traced her fingers along the edge of one quote, "I will not apologize for refusing to disappear." And for the first time in a long while, she smiled, not because it was over, but because it had begun. Change hadn't arrived on a silver platter. It had come in the form of a quiet girl with sharp eyes, a strong voice, and a refusal to be erased. And Lincoln High, flawed and slow as it was, would never be the same. The walls had heard her. And finally they had listened. Long after the applause faded, after the cameras were packed away and the auditorium lights dimmed to their usual hush, Zara sat alone on the edge of the school's stone steps, her fingers tracing the worn curve of the last stair. Evening had painted the sky in hues of quiet lavender and gold, the kind of light that made even brick buildings feel like they had hearts that beat. Her dress still held the scent of the night's celebration, flowers, perfume, something intangible like pride, but her thoughts drifted inward. It wasn't about glory or revenge or even recognition anymore. The weight she'd carried wasn't something that disappeared just because people finally clapped. It wasn't applause that healed you. It was what you did with your truth once the world stopped watching. She looked out across the lawn where, months earlier, she'd walked from the principal's office with her knees trembling, humiliated and stunned by the accusation. Back then, her name had been spoken with suspicion. Now it echoed in banners and scholarships and hallways where students whisper her story, like a myth that meant something real. But in that echo, Zara knew the truth. It wasn't her name that mattered. It was the lesson it carved into the bones of that school. For every student who had ever been underestimated because of how they looked or where they came from, for every brilliant mind silenced before it had the chance to speak, for every quiet rebel forced to prove their worth twice over, Zara's story had become more than hers. It had become a mirror. And mirrors don't lie. They reflect. She took out her phone and opened the draft of the speech she hadn't used that night. Her original ending was still there. Simple. Unpolished. Honest. She read it aloud to the empty courtyard, her voice low but firm. "I didn't set out to start anything. I just wanted to be seen. But if what I've done makes even one teacher pause before dismissing a student's brilliance, or helps one kid believe they're worth more than what someone else expects of them, then I've done something bigger than win. I've broken silence." The wind tugged gently at the hem of her dress, almost as if in agreement. A warm breeze, no longer heavy with dread or uncertainty, but full of something else. Possibility. Behind her, the atrium lights remained on, illuminating the display of her story, the essays, the pictures, the words others had left. It was no longer about her. It had grown into something communal, collective, a quiet revolution wrapped in paper and voices. Zara stood slowly, her spine straight, her gaze clear. The night was falling, but she was not walking into darkness. She was stepping into her future, one no longer bound by doubt, or assumptions, or the fear of being too much or not enough. And as she walked toward the parking lot, toward home, toward whatever would come next, One thought stayed with her like a breath that never quite leaves. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to refuse to be erased.